Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Before we get started, I'm wondering how your stress levels are these days. Could you use a few extra minutes each week to decompress, chill out, relax? If so, then take note. Starting Wednesday, August 26th, we'll be offering Unwind, a free weekly drop-in practice session that will last about 30 minutes, just long enough, hopefully, to fit between all your other tasks and to-dos. Each week, we will give you a brief, science-backed stress management or well-being enhancement morsel of wisdom. Then we'll spend 10 or 15 minutes leading a guided relaxation, meditation, or contemplation practice. Lastly, we'll end with a few minutes for discussion and personal connection. I started leading sessions like these last spring after the pandemic hit, and they've been great. It's amazing how relaxed you can get with just a few minutes of practice, and how much we can connect as human beings even in the strange land of Zoom. So you can get more details and sign up to get the Zoom link and call-in information at noblemindpodcast.com.
Hello, I'm Alex Gukcha.
And I'm Dr. Kate King. In this episode, we talked to Dr. Sunil Lad about his work in the UK prison system, masculinity, and the importance of embodiment, forgiveness, and compassion.
Dr. Lad is a consultant counseling psychologist for the National Health Service and a qualified yoga teacher in the UK. He holds chartered status with the British Psychological Society and is experienced in forensic mental health as well as working with clients in the community, secure environments, and custodial settings. He has conducted trainings for staff in the criminal justice sector and worked on better understanding personality disorders and complex behaviors and presentations.
You can learn more about Sunil and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy this episode. We are here with Dr. Sunil Lad. Welcome to Noble Mind.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
We thought we'd just get started by having you tell our audience a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So I'm a consultant counselling psychologist working in the National Health Service in the UK. So I cover various prisons, but I've also offered work in the community and supporting people from being diverted from prison and doing mental health treatment with them in the community. On top of that, I'm also a qualified yoga teacher. I started my training 3 years ago now, and yeah, it's been quite fascinating to see my journey unfold. You know, working as a qualified psychologist for the last 12 years now, and really being stuck in the head and to recognize that actually, especially working in prisons for a very long time now, recognizing that trauma happens to the body. And so when we get stuck in the head intellectualizing things, what we're missing out is that embodied experience of life. So I guess, I had my own journey of yoga and how that started to change things for me personally. And just going to a few classes wasn't enough. So I did my teacher training. And I guess for me now, it kind of has changed how I think, how I feel, and how I work really. Just it's opened up my world in a whole different way, and hopefully it's keeping me motivated to work with this really challenging group of people and to make a difference. I wouldn't even say that it's this group which is challenging, it's the system around it, the dark side of humanity which we're dealing with, which is really tough because I think it's quite easy that we as a society want to project our stuff to these individuals who've done this horrendous stuff, but we've all got it in us.
My hope in this conversation is that by hearing more about your own experiences working kind of in the, like you said, the sort of hotbed of where you're around all day, people who've caused great harm, that you could maybe help all of us think about how we relate, both to thinking about incarcerated individuals, but also harm in general, or people who we relate to in our own lives caused us harm. And, I think there's a lot to extrapolate from the work that you do into other places and settings.
Yeah, and I guess just thinking about that, what comes up for me is how the work of Professor Paul Gilbert has again changed my kind of outlook again of sitting with compassion, of, you know, really recognizing that suffering is endemic within the world, within all of us. And in order for us to survive, we switch off from suffering. You know, otherwise, you know, we switch off from climate change, we switch off from our connection to the earth, our connection of suffering. And I guess that's what's, for me, Corona has really identified, in recognizing all the stuff that now that we've had a bit of a break, well, some of us have, actually kind of questioning our lives, how we do things, but sometimes seeing more suffering. And I guess how we respond to that is different for everyone, because some people can't deal with that suffering. And I guess, you know, I've spoken to friends, of colleagues, and what's something that's really come out for me over the last 6 months is people who cannot deal with suffering because they've not got the ability to, for whatever reason, whether that's kind of European Western cultures, which means we've got to kind of block our emotion off and be strong and powerful and all of those things, which mean that if we actually go towards suffering, it's seen as something which is weak. And if we've been taught, especially as men, not to cry or that's wrong, then actually what do? We go into all sorts of different ways to deflect, to minimize, to blame, or to focus on others. And I guess that's when those in-group, out-group psychologies start to come. We get all tribal. And I guess that's where we see a lot of separation, whether that's in politics or just how we have but day-to-day conversations with each other. And I guess for me, it's about, again, how yoga is about union. And how can we put together and have conversations about these divides where we have, if it's mind-body divides or earth and ourselves as human beings, how can we put it together and recognize a common humanity and suffering, really?
It seems like you're also describing that divide within ourselves of what we're willing to feel and what we're not willing to feel, or what we're willing to approach or not approach. I'm thinking about that split within ourselves too, right? We sort of deflect, push things away, and then sort of only keep the feelings we want to feel. I don't know how effective that really is in the long run, but...
Or we use drugs to mask it, or alcohol, or just pleasure. You know, I guess within psychology, we've got the positive psychology movement, and people just want to focus on good stuff. And then there's nothing wrong in that. But I guess then we miss out the shadow, don't we? We kind of avoid looking at the shadow, the pain and misery, and that is part of being human, unfortunately. But it feels painful. And obviously, we're designed not to go towards pain, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Would you like to say more about the shadow and the dark side?
Well, I guess we've all got, there is a dark side within all of society, really. You know, if we think about not only society now, but if we look at our history, if we think about entertainment, there is something quite sadistic about what we watch. We might not be doing it, but, you know, I loved programs like the Game of Thrones and those kind of things. And it was violence, it was rape, but there was something about when we watch those things, we get quite excited. We're quite dissociated from it. Obviously, not everyone enjoys those programs, but even if we think about James Bond and, you know, fighting and entertainment of, you know, kind of boxing, and we have vicious, they're not probably what we had hundreds of years ago where we were watching people being killed in terms of, you know, kind of torture or capital punishment. Maybe you do have that in America, but luckily we don't. We've got rid of the death penalty here. But, you know, people used to watch people being flogged, and that was a day out, or even the Roman games. And I think we've got to really recognize that there is this dark side of humanity which we thrive on. pain and suffering, but I guess we become dissociated from that. So it's easier to see it in others, but actually switch off from the pain that someone might be feeling of just being killed or brutally attacked.
You also co-authored a paper on the treatment of antisocial personality disorder.
The model that was used within that paper was cognitive analytic therapy. So I guess that was looking at how do we relate, and that model looked at examples of, if we think about the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, when you relate to someone either kind of in a very callous way, so you're very bullying, but you're creating a victim, and I guess it's been really interesting when I've done kind of cat work to recognize when that way of relating, that template, you kind of get pulled into it, whether you're on the receiving end or the giving end. That kind of work is really interesting for me. And I guess that's what makes me think, especially in therapy sometimes, we might, when I've read about what people have done, that there's some really powerful emotions of disgust or fear or absolute anger. And I guess it's really important that we as psychologists really spend time exploring those things, but I guess where they don't get explored. So yes, we as psychologists get lots of training, supervision, all of those kind of things, but the people dealing with people in prison on a day-to-day basis don't get that support. So they might know what that person's done, but actually the level of supervision isn't there to recognize that, the person you're dealing with might have killed someone, one, two, number of people. They might have raped other people. And if we think about what that brings up for them, that might bring up their threat system. But actually, if they're coming to work because they've got to pay the bills in their threat system, actually, they've got to tone that down. And what do? Well, I guess they need to have a level of dissociation because they've not got places to take it. So we have various routes. So you either kind of dissociate. And I guess, it's really important if we think about Philip Zimbardo's work in the Stanford prison experiment, if you think about what he did in the expert witness trials in Abu Ghraib, those behaviors, he found that in the experiment, he found that in those prisons, when there weren't the checks and balances, when staff were allowed to do whatever they wanted, these things can happen. And I guess it's not just that evil people who have done evil acts do those things. If we have certain environments, we as human beings can do awful things.
How do you combine your interests in compassion, yoga, and the body in your work in prisons?
So I guess it's ever evolving in a way. I guess I feel like I'm only at the beginning of this journey. And at the moment, it's about how do I sit in the room with someone? What can I pick up on their body language, which actually I didn't used to pick up before, because actually I was focusing so much more on what I was feeling in the room, thinking about my countertransference reactions, all of those things. But now kind of thinking about the body, what is someone's body telling me? Am I looking at how they're breathing if we're talking about something which is particularly emotive? Can I not see them breathing, or are they breathing really shallow, which is quite disconnected to what they're saying? Are they quite dissociated, and therefore do we need to practice some grounding? Not only that, if someone has been using loads of drugs for a very long time, what is the connection that they've got with their body? How have they learned how to deal with their body? And I think what's really interesting for me, especially working within Category A prisons, is when I walk around and I see these men with this armor around them, and the armor is their muscles. So they've spent so much time building themselves up, because actually inside is a level of vulnerability which in that type of environment gets preyed upon. And actually no one wants to be vulnerable, because that means your survival goes out the window.
I've heard you say that following your yoga teacher training, the embodied experience you have in your therapeutic practice has changed. And people sitting with you can pick up on this, and it allows them to go deeper. I wonder if you can say a few more things about that.
Yeah, so I guess it's strange because, as I spoke about my height, one of the things that I've, in a way, maybe I kind of subconsciously showed to my clients, don't go there. So it was never discussed. But since my yoga teacher training, there, people have kind of randomly able to talk about not only their suffering, but recognizing that I would have gone through suffering myself. And I don't know whether there's something subconsciously that I'm able to now present that I am more comfortable with myself, whereas previously I wasn't able to do that.
What aspects of this work do people in prisons benefit most from?
So I guess for me, and I guess the difficulty is that I don't see as many clients anymore, but the thing that I feel really helps people is that basic psychoeducation on understanding the fight and flight system, of understanding generally our threat systems, that we're evolved in this way, understanding old brain and new brain, that we think back, we experience emotions like shame and disgust, and especially if we think back to those things that we're not, that we were shamed about. Just doing that education, for men in their 40s, 50s, 30s, it is extremely powerful, I find. So it helps them to understand that the experience. I think the difficulty we often have is that, people will say to me, yeah, I've gone through really bad stuff, but it's not an excuse that I've gone and done these awful things, or it's not an excuse that I feel all these things. I should have got over it by now. And in terms of compassion-focused therapy, I love the saying of, it's not your fault. But I always add the caveat, but it's your responsibility. Now that I'm giving you this information, actually, it's your responsibility to change these things. It's your responsibility to recognize you've got a fight and flight system, but also you can do these practices, which will make you more aware, which will give you more control. So again, it's that kind of compassionate approach where we're recognizing that you have experienced suffering, which means that you've coped in the best way possible. Now we need to change that, so you're not causing so much harm, not only to yourself, but to others as well.
That last thing you said, that you've experienced suffering, you've coped in the best way possible. Can you say a little more about that?
So I guess in terms of the clinic, in terms of working with men in prison, there's extreme poverty people have experienced, extreme neglect, trauma, so physical abuse, sexual abuse. The stories that I've heard of people's lives are extremely harrowing, and I guess none of us would wish that on our worst enemy in a way. Well, some of the things that people have gone through, kind of being raised in environments which were just not safe. So it's totally understandable that actually anger has been helpful. Actually, without anger, some of the people that I've worked with never have survived through life. And in a way, it's about recognizing then, especially as adults, they become their ways of surviving. They haven't had any other ways to cope, or had other opportunities to learn other experiences, to undo those experiences. And also, I guess, services, whether, especially some of the men have been in the care system, end up in prison from a very young age, in and out of prison. So they're just constantly in survival mode. And I guess it goes back to one of the other things that I'm really interested in, is thinking about masculinity. We know that there are more men in prison than women. So what is it about men? And I think there's something about, we as a society are not comfortable with men being vulnerable. So instead they've got to put up this armor because it's not safe to say, oh God, I'm really struggling with this. There's a big stigma on men talking about emotions. I remember a few years ago, I did some training and we were just talking about masculinity and suicide. And a number of people said, if a man started crying, a grown man, I'd say, man up. You know, there is something about we as a society are not comfortable with men being vulnerable. And I guess that, you know, in terms of our leaders, whether you've got Boris Johnson or Donald Trump, are very much, yeah, we're strong men. But look at all the pain and suffering they are causing. Where's the humility? Where is the compassion? It's just not there.
You see in offenders dynamics, psychological dynamics that are similar to psychological dynamics you observe in men in power.
Yeah, I guess it's really interesting if we think about shame as an emotion. It's an extremely powerful emotion, and I think what I'm seeing is those dynamics about minimization, deflection, and it's really interesting thinking about work. I think where I really started to recognize this was over the last few months since the Black Lives Matter movement, and just seeing people's responses, first thinking about the focus on statues and rioting rather than what was actually being discussed, and minimization here, saying, oh well, it's not like America, things are okay over here in the UK, when we know there is institutional, you know, racism and inequality. And yeah, it just kind of made me reflect on working with men who'd sexually offended and seeing very similar responses of, don't go there, you know, I'm just going to minimize this because it's too painful, because there's that fear of shame. And again, you know, thinking about what I was saying earlier, there's something about why men, especially men in powerful positions, aren't necessarily, but I guess it's not just about blaming these men, it's about recognizing how our institutions, how our media, you know, kind of the trial by media that we have. Like if someone has done something wrong, everyone's like, yeah, sack them, rather than let's learn why has these things happened. And I think it's that kind of, again, that threat-focused way of surviving. That means that if someone is in their threat system, it's too difficult to go to vulnerable places. And I think, going back to your point, Alex, of thinking about leaders, I think within our systems and institutions, we are so threat-focused, whether that's threat-focused healthcare or drive-focused, which is just focused on achievement and doing. You know, how can we have societies which are focused on care, you know, focused on attachment, focused on bonding, focused on community? Because that's essentially what's going to make us thrive as human beings. But I guess because we live, especially in the West, on focusing on the economy, on production, actually, it's not about people, it's about money. And then that humanity goes out the window.
You've mentioned shame a few times and the avoidance of feeling shame. And I'm wondering if you think there's something distinct about shame that people don't want to experience, or is it just kind of any vulnerable feeling that people kind of try to push away?
I guess shame is, you know, having done quite a lot of work in the last few years on compassion-focused therapy, I guess shame is a big thing. Shame can be for a whole host of reasons, you know, especially for men. Shame related to having perceptions of being weak, of not being strong enough, or shame of all sorts of things, you know, shame of just being themselves, you know, messages they may have, we might all have experienced as children, you know, not being tall enough, not being strong enough, all of those things. So what do? We compensate in all sorts of ways rather than really turn in towards, well, do I need to feel shame for those things?
Some people, including me at times, when we see people in power misbehave, then the idea comes up, they should be ashamed of themselves.
Mm.
So that presumably is not going down a helpful path.
No, and I think that's the thing. If we outwardly shame people, and we it happens in the criminal justice system, the focus often becomes on the crime that person's done, rather than let's really try and understand that person's story, which meant they committed this crime. If we think about the criminal justice system going into court, you're there and you've got to kind of stand below a judge, and they will say, what you did was abhorrent, and your face will be plastered all over the papers, and it's a deep level of shame. So I think publicly shaming people is not a deterrent. It's about actually how can we, because, even within the offending population, what we know is that high levels of shame linked to reoffending. What we want to do is bring that shame down, but increase guilt. There's a difference between that shame and guilt. Shame makes us think, oh God, I'm a bad person, and I don't want other people to see I'm a bad person or that I'm a defective or whatever. Whereas guilt makes us recognize we've got that strength to recognize I've done a bad thing. I want to now go and repair the damage that I've done. Whereas shame makes us want to go and hide and conceal it. And I think the more we keep shaming people, what we're leading to is them either dissociating or trying to conceal it. The way to hold people responsible for their actions is to firstly make them feel safe, that we can then be accountable to those people. Whereas if we are shaming people, then actually they don't feel a sense of safety. And I think that's for me, my deep learning point from people, working with people in prison. If they do not feel safe, they are not going to share with me their history, whether that's what's led them to come into jail or what has happened to them throughout their lives. I think it's about how do we create situations which make people feel safe, and they're not going to be openly shamed. And that's when we can then hold people responsible to then sit with them rather than over them. And I think in terms of how do we hold leaders accountable is to recognize that power has again got a dark side. People are also scared of losing that power, which means that they will do all sorts of things to keep that power. Whereas what we need really is humble people that recognize we've got a common humanity. We're all fallible. We can all make mistakes, but also thinking about our systems around us. And I guess it's hard, isn't it? If we think about our politics, politicians only have a certain term before being re-elected, and therefore they're striving to make sure that they stay in power. With the men that I work with, again, our system has been, for those with more serious crimes, you need to demonstrate that you've reduced your risk. But if you're in an environment where you don't feel safe, you can go on all the courses that you want. But actually, if the environment around you is unsafe, it's going to be very hard for you to change, because our brain runs on the principle it's better to be safe than sorry. So again, we need to kind of create a world where it's safer than it currently is. It's no wonder we've got refugees moving from war-torn countries, trying to come to places like the US and the UK and stuff, because they're trying to get safety, because within their lives, the opportunities have gone. But what are we doing? We're demonizing them. We're saying they're going to come and take away our culture or to create loads of crime within our country. And people are saying sink their ships when they come and awful stuff, rather than really recognizing why these people are leaving.
I'm thinking about there's this sort of fantasy I think that people have, that maybe I'm going back a point from something from what you just said, but there's this fantasy that people have that, somebody commits a crime, either they just get deleted, like they just go to jail forever and then they're gone from society. They're just, set adrift and locked up. Or they've been bad and they're going to go to prison and just sort of think about what they've done and somehow magically on their own transform into some rehabilitated person and come out after X years changed. And sort of what you're pointing to is that actually at some point, if we actually want people to transform, somebody, such as persons like you working in prisons, has to take a risk to create a safe environment for this person or to offer an environment where they can really self-reflect,
And that's going to be really hard if you're in this confined cell, sharing a toilet with someone you don't know that could have done something equally really difficult, and you can't even think about closing your eyes because your warning system is telling you if you're with strangers harm you. How do we regulate our emotions in order to feel safe with that level of and lack of safety? But then if we can create environments where we're allowing these men to connect outside of crime, make them be vulnerable. There's a really powerful film, it's documentary called The Work. Yeah, it kind of got me in tears, really. It's a really powerful film to recognize the trauma, but to get these men to connect and to create that space to allow that to happen. And yeah, how do we create societies, not just in prison, where especially a lot of men can do those things? Because I think, within society, women do that quite often. They're able to share, but then, there are lots of men's groups coming on, which are starting this. They're recognizing that, suicide in men is pretty high. Men don't have a space to go and talk and discuss their wounds in a way. And let's create safe spaces for men to do this. So I'm a big advocate for men's work as well.
As a woman myself, I often think about how women sort of connect to this, because I think sometimes when we talk about, men can't be vulnerable, it's sort of like everyone complains that that's a men's problem, but I think about, as a woman, I think about, well, how do I contribute to that? And especially since, at this point in the world, women still do more of the child care and the raising of their little boys. I can't help but wonder whether there are ways that as women, we're not really self-reflecting about how we participate in continuing that, so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. But.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting because within the yoga world, there's kind of the masculine and there's feminine. And we actually, as human beings, have both aspects within ourselves. So how do both females support men in this work, but also how do men be able to tap into their feminine aspects? But I think, again, it's that oneness, isn't it, of not men going and doing men's work separately, but how do we come together? And I know my yoga teacher, we were looking at this. I was like, let's create some men's circles and stuff. And I know he said to me, well, but actually, why aren't we doing this together? I think there's a need for separate spaces, but there's also a need to come together.
In terms of feeling compassion and forgiveness for people who have seriously harmed others, I've noticed that if I watch a documentary about a person who's done some bad things, then I'm like, sure, yeah, he deserves to be forgiven. But then I'm not forgiving of my neighbor who plays loud music. So now, especially when the perpetrator is not being held accountable or is in a position of power over the victim. And you also talk about how you experienced a breakthrough when you felt forgiveness for yourself for not wanting to address your body.
I guess forgiveness can only happen when we tap into the emotion, whether that's sadness or, I don't know, fear or guilt. When we recognize that we've done some harm, whether to ourselves or to others, that's only when we can go and have that forgiveness. Well, I think probably people like, I've not necessarily done enough research on forgiveness and kind of certain religions will say we need to forgive. But I guess, again, yes, we do need to forgive because in a way if we're constantly living in anger, there's something that we're emitting. So maybe it's important that we think about how we forgive, but at the same time, still hold other people accountable. Because I think there's something about forgiveness, but then you ignore it, which allows a problem to continue. But forgiveness is also about, yes, I forgive you for that, but actually I'm going to hold you accountable so you don't do it again.
Yeah, it reminds me of what you were saying a little while back about, what was it? It's not your fault, but you're responsible. It feels like a similar idea. Yeah, like I can forgive you, but you also need to take responsibility, make some effort at repair, be accountable for your actions.
Yeah. Because that's the thing, in terms of forgiveness, there's the famous saying, forgive, but I never forget. For me, that kind of shows you there's still a wound there of, I've not truly forgiven you because I'm not going to forget that thing that I've apparently forgiven you for. Whereas, if you're really in true forgiveness, it's about having a deep understanding of why that situation happened and to kind of walk past it and walk through it in a way.
Yeah, I think that phrase, forgive and forget, or forgive but don't forget, like it gets really like it's all in the tone of voice in which the person says it, because it can have an almost threatening sound, like you're forgiven, but I'll never forget. Well, then am I forgiven? I don't know. Maybe I'm not, but I also understand that if somebody's really harmed you, the relationship can't go back to what it was. So in that regard, it's not like you're forgiven, so let's pretend that never happened. It does mean that there's been some, possibly depending on the harm, some way in which things can't go back to how they were or can't be repaired.
And I guess it's about the time that requires, but also what is needed for that repair to happen. That can lead to a deep level of vulnerability, which, again, some people might be really uncomfortable with, to recognize that actually I take responsibility for what happened, and this is why it happened. It's about responsibility without blame.
Yeah, I'm thinking about I don't know if you're familiar with the Gottman couples therapy, but they do a lot of work with overcoming affairs. And one of the things that they say helps predict success for a couple that they're going to be able to repair after an affair, that rhymes, is whether the person who had the affair is able to truly be and demonstrate that they are a different person now, that they have grown, that they are not they're like literally like a transformed individual from the person who perpetrated that betrayal, and I'm wondering, there's probably something similar to that as you're in the language of prisons. It's probably like risk of reoffense. Has it changed? Has it gone down? But there's something about you need to show you're different.
Yeah. And for me, that's about insight, but also creating the conditions to allow that insight to develop, to recognize I am not using an excuse, but this happened because of X, Y, and Z, but also this part of my emotions overtook me, and this is why it overtook me. But actually now I've got the skills to do X, Y, and Z. So, yeah.
And what would you say is the difference between responsibility and blame?
I guess taking responsibility is kind of saying I'm holding myself accountable, whereas I guess it depends who is doing the blaming. So if it's someone else, I would be wondering, why is that blame being apportioned to that individual? Is it done in a threatening way? Is it done in a shaming way? Is it done in a humiliating way? Is it? So then all the focus becomes on that one individual rather than the environment in which it happened in. So we're seeing at the moment, kind of who is to blame for how coronavirus is being managed at the moment. For me, no one's to be blamed. I think sometimes we always want to blame the government in a way. And there is certain decisions that we think, well, actually, why did you make those decisions? But I guess, again, if we've got leaders who don't want to be accountable or who are fearing all sorts of things, they're not going to take any responsibility. So it's all good as pointing the finger and trying to blame them. But actually, if they're not going to take it, then what's the point in a way? How do we, again, create environments and conditions where we stop shaming people and recognize that we need to kind of think about common humanity?
I don't need to tell you that the Black Lives Matter movement has spread to the UK and as well as Australia, Canada, France, Germany. I'm wondering what your perspective is on it.
So I guess for me, my perspective on it is that it's brought kind of a level of consciousness. Whilst we always knew that kind of there was deep inequality, I don't know whether COVID has, because we're kind of in this strange world at the moment, it allowed, whilst this inequality has been there for a very long time, it kind of brought it to the surface more than it ever has before. And I think it really made me think. So, within the organization which I work in, we've had various talks on, what are we doing as a profession to deal with racism? If I think about even psychology and, working in an environment where Black men are disproportionately overrepresented within the prison population, but actually, are they coming to therapy? I wouldn't necessarily say it's a proportionate figure. And therefore, I'm thinking, well, actually, what is it about therapy which might be Eurocentric, which mean that we just don't get Black men through the door or Asian men? What do we need to do to change? And I guess I'm in a very different position in a way. Whilst my parents are from India and I've got that kind of background, I've been born and raised in the UK. So in terms of how I've been socialized, it's very much been British. So I've been, the therapy that I do is coming from a very Western model. So whilst my skin is brown, how I'm doing my job is not brown. And so I guess in terms of representation, it's not there. And I guess it's really made me think about actually how do we, and I think, again, as I've been talking today, it's not just all about the mind and talking and intellectualizing. It's also about how can we get into the body. So how can we help Black men or all people of color when we know, from my experience, again, thinking about emotions, that can be a really tough thing to feel and talk about in other cultures.
You also say that now parts of the world are really listening and having conversations, but then other people are really scared about those conversations.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, isn't it? Because again, if people are dissociated from suffering and they've got to kind of look at it, that can be really tough. It's interesting if we think about the type of people who are very much against it. It is a cohort of, I'd say, older people. And I think if we, for me to have a compassionate approach, it's recognizing that not all, but if we think about how older people might have been socialized, it is that very much war mentality, stiff upper lip, you could just get on with it. And I guess if people start delving into suffering, it's going to be so overwhelming. So again, it's easier not to go there. And that's why people might be feeling really uncomfortable, hence the responses that we've had. And the focus then becomes on the politics of the movement of that. Apparently it's about defunding the police and rather than keeping us safe. And I guess some people feel really threatened by equality because that means that people lose power.
Or at least there's the fear of having to share it. Yeah.
I guess, and we see that whether that's about Black people having equal power or whether that's rich, making poor people have equal wealth.
It sounds like you're pointing to a generational divide in the UK around emotional expression, that the older generation there at this point grew up and were socialized at a time where the stiff upper lip mentality was like even stronger than it is now. So when people are wanting to talk about the feeling of being hurt, or the experiences of harm in their communities or culture as people of color, that people who were raised in this very different kind of mindset around how you handle emotion, it just doesn't gel. It feels very threatening, or like, we don't do that, like just sort of bootstrap it.
Yeah, and I guess that goes back to, if we think about early attachment, if they grew up in the war era and stuff, and their parents, because everyone was in survival mode back then, the level of poverty and stuff, that ability to be attuned to your child just wasn't there. For some, and I'm not saying for all, but if that wasn't there, so then again, you've not got that ability to go there physically, or if you do, it's just way too overwhelming.
In terms of steering away from demonizing people we disagree with, that's a trap that many of us fall into. You talk about, how can I recognize that they're part of me? How can I sit in suffering and see their struggle?
I guess it's hard, isn't it? If and I think social media has got this way of kind of reeling you in. The amount of time I spent on social media, especially when Black Lives Matter happened, getting so angry about the amount of deflection I was seeing, and it's then stepping back. And yeah, I guess I've gone on a journey in my way to kind of think about this conversation that we're having now, of recognizing that those people, there's a reason that they're reacting in that kind of way. But I guess, again, when our threat systems are on, it's very hard to kind of see their humanity and to recognize where they're coming from, because what they're saying just feels so abhorrent, and it's because they're so tuned out of the suffering in a way, because it's so difficult for some people to see and to tap into. And I guess that's the same thing, isn't it? Of why I guess we don't necessarily, if we think about people who've committed crimes, it's the same kind of reaction that we have to people who've committed crimes. We want to shame them. We want to say what you've done is wrong and all of those kind of things, or try to educate them. But actually, without them feeling safe, that's not going to happen. And I guess it's difficult at the moment because, again, I think, a specific cohort of people have probably felt really left out. I'm just seeing some of the stuff on conspiracy, and there are, in a way, people who are tapped into a particular narrative about blaming the state, and a big fear that people who think more progressively want this deep state to come in. And I think it's hard, isn't it, of how do you have a conversation where I try and recognize where you're coming from? And I guess, again, is there suffering here which people aren't listening to? Because instead, what we're doing at the moment is we're focusing on the suffering of Black people. That is truly awful what's happened. But I guess then we're not listening to the suffering that has also happened for other groups of people. And I think that there's a fear, isn't there, in terms of equality, there's a fear that other suffering won't be listened to. But, the Black Lives Matter is not about not listening to the suffering of other people.
Yeah, I think it's connects to this threat system idea, right? When your threat system is activated, then you're afraid. Acknowledging anyone else's suffering diminishes from people's awareness of your own. You feel threatened by other people expressing views that you don't share, what have you. And to the extent that any of us can manage our own threat response, then maybe things can improve.
Yeah, but only when I think we're so unconsciously responding to our threat system that half the time we don't even realize it's on. And I think it's about how do we slow down and recognize, oh, here it is. And that's hard if you're constantly on the go or you're multitasking. And I think the way that we live our lives at the moment make it tough to really tune in to what's going on for us.
And compassion-focused therapy informed you conceptually, but then yoga helped learn how to be in your body. And there's overlap between yoga philosophy and CFT. I think you said ahimsa, nonviolence, can also be considered the opposite of self-critical thinking. So self-criticism can be a form of violence.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, we again do this so automatically without realizing. So I guess, if I think about yoga philosophy, it's about how do we walk the path in a way, if we think about ahimsa, of non-violence. For me, that is compassion. And how do we have this motivation of compassion to not only ourselves, but to others in everything that we do? And that is quite some mean feat, because the way that we are designed means that our threat systems come on very quickly. But at the same time, if we're in certain environments and certain situations, our threat systems can come on very quickly. And I guess, it's interesting. The concept of karma, I absolutely hated, just because of how I understood it growing up. And I guess it's a very powerful one of every action has a reaction. So if we are compassionate in our day-to-day lives, that action is like planting a seed, and we're watering it. And actually, the more that we do that, whether that's compassion to ourselves or to others, that's just a different action that we then start to live in a more caring world, as opposed to a threat-based world, which we live in quite often.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for all the seeds of compassion that you are planting in the world.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Sunil.
So how can people find you in the world if they want to hear more of your thinking and ideas on these matters?
I've got my Twitter handle, and at the moment there's various things in the pipeline. So hopefully within the Compassionate Mind Foundation, there'll be some work that we'll be looking at in terms of getting into the body, but also the yoga school that I trained with, so the Contemporary School of Yoga, especially now with coronavirus, will be offering various teachings and trainings, which I will be part of as well. So yeah, lots of exciting things. So either those are the two schools of places to find me, really.
Well, thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.